When I saw this research report, I knew I need to have the company and some of the principles behind it join us here at SaaS Metrics Palooza 24. So I'm privileged to introduce you to Scott Goring and Evan Whitty. Is that right, Evan?
That's correct.
I got it. From Battery Ventures. So I'm going to get off the stage and the show is yours.
Thanks, Ray. We're excited to be here and to share this research that we published just in the last couple of weeks called the State of Enterprise Tech Spend. For those of you that don't know, Battery is a 41-year-old venture in PE that invests heavily around enterprise IT for the digital builder and also in the B2B software space. For anyone that wants the full report, you can find it for download on battery.com. So just a quick disclaimer that this isn't intended to be investment advice, but hopefully you find this incredibly helpful in your day-to-day work. So the quick summary of this report is things are positive out there. As we look across three key trends here, and we'll dive into these more as we go, budgets are increasing. And it's very interesting that many of the respondents to this survey, 59% cited experimental budgets as the key driver for increasing budgets. We'll touch on this in depth, but the AI wave is still coming. And then the third part, which we won't spend a lot of time dwelling on, is that the hiring is really stabilizing in the tech industry. So where respondents have downward pressure on their budgets, fewer and fewer of those are looking to reduce headcount as a way to fulfill that metric. We think that this is very positive, both in terms of it's a long-term investment to hire somebody, and also these people end up buying tools and seats and SaaS software for these folks to be productive.
Thanks, Scott. As we look at this survey, one of the things we wanted to highlight was the composition of it. So this is a survey representing over 100 CXOs that have over $35 billion in annual tech spend. These organizations, roughly 90%, are coming from companies that have over 1,000 employees, and 65% have over $100 million in tech spend. Nobody within this survey has less than $20 million in technical spend, and it's a relative sampling across a number of industries with a decent concentration in financial services, healthcare, and technology. As Scott mentioned a little bit earlier, we actually see a level of excitement when we look at Q1 versus the same time we asked this question in Q3 as far as budgets increasing. So 74% are anticipating an increase to their budget over the next 12 months, versus 6 months ago, that number was only 55%. The other thing that we've noticed is less people are sitting in the middle. Those that are unchanged has gone down, and the number of people that have a down budget is even fewer. The exciting thing for us when we look at SaaS companies and the opportunity ahead for a lot of the people joining this conference is that 69% of those that are increasing their budget are citing experimental budget or new technologies. Really what this ends up meaning is that these budgets are increasing, and it's not just because of existing vendors. They're actually looking to put new money to work in things and new technologies. A lot of that is around things that have generative AI, whether that's a component of vertical SaaS or actually implementing generative AI tools for digital builders. When we look at those that are decreasing, the two main levers that people are looking to have to reduce their spend is vendor consolidation and workforce reduction. We don't see a huge number of those in the workforce reduction side, but vendor consolidation is a factor, especially among SaaS companies. And then the last thing that we'll touch on here is generative AI is a component that a lot of these organizations and enterprise buyers are looking for. It's not critical across everyone, but it's a high importance. So I'd expect that a number of companies, as they go up for SaaS renewals, are going to try and understand what is the generative AI story, are there capabilities that are kind of come in-house for these SaaS solutions that they're purchasing. When we look at the top CXOs and their spending priorities over the next 12 months, generative AI and large language models really burst onto the scene with OpenAI making it synonymous not only at the board level, but also the engineer, even grandma or your roommate. One of the things that we're seeing here is that cloud infrastructure remains really, really strong. Data warehouse moving down in the priorities of spend is somewhat natural, as a lot of the people have their cloud data and starting to get a handle over that. And as they bring more of that into operationalizing data, we'll see more of an importance on generative AI, and even in some cases, AI security coming up into that mix. As we look at a shorter term over the next 6 months, we did a breakdown in a few key categories, specifically developer tools, security, data, AI, and ML. What we can clearly see is that over the next 6 months, there's a large number, 60% are planning to increase their budget in AI and ML. You contrast that with only 16% planning to increase their developer tool budget. We asked some questions around developer tool consolidation, and there's a large number of organizations that are thinking about dev tool consolidation. Specifically, that also relates to those that are implementing AI. If there's an implementation of AI that organizations are looking at, and they have a large number of either tech spend or enterprise employees that are focused on developers, we're seeing that kind of be a place where organizations are really trying to get a handle over the dev tool chain and have some restrictions around that. When we look at AI and generative AI specifically, you compare it to cloud migrations, which was a multi-year thing. It took a long time for organizations to get into the cloud, AWS, Google, and beyond. And a lot of them are still in that kind of migration. The fact that we thought that generative AI, once OpenAI came out, was going to instantly be live amongst all these organizations and all these enterprises within a year, I think was a level of optimism versus reality. If you look at kind of the far left side of this chart and that blue line, that's what we asked these 100 CXOs a year ago. When do you plan on having generative AI live in production? As you can look, that group thought that 80% were going to have generative AI capabilities live in production today. The reality is that's sitting less than 40%. And that level of optimism and that curve has really held true every single time that we've asked this question over the last few cycles. For us, that shows that this wave is still building. It wasn't a short blip of hype and then that hype has gone down. The hype has been sustained, but the ability for organizations to really bring generative AI to life is slower than they anticipated, which could be a mix of things from cultural DNA. You have to be willing to accept levels of gray or shades of gray. Not everything is as binary. And as we'll touch on a little bit later, part of that is also the internal talent that you have and the ability to actually bring these things to life, which is still kind of being built out. I'll pass it back to you, Scott.
Perfect. So we believe that there is this generative AI wave building, and a little bit of the data shows that out. When we asked the 100 CXOs how many use cases they had identified in their enterprise, the average was 36.5. But when you get into the internals of this, only 5.5% or around 2 use cases are actually in production today. Now, the right-hand side of the chart shows where they think out of this 36.5 use cases identified, what percentage will be in production over the next 6, 12, 18, and 24 months. What you can see is in 2 years, they expect about half or a little more than half of these 36.5 use cases to be in production. This is a combination of both SaaS use cases, in-house developed use cases, but specifically what we're not asking about here is things like copilots that you would get with Office 365 or other products. The other interesting thing to note as we move on to this next slide is how AI use cases go across the different tech spends. So going left to right, it's larger tech spends, and you see clearly the number of use cases growing. up to somewhere around 70 for people with more than $1 billion of tech spend. It's worth noting in Evan and I's conversations with leaders at large enterprises, this can expand wildly. So from speaking to banks, global insurance companies, and others, we see people report 500, 800, even greater than 1,000 use cases identified within their enterprise. Another interesting aspect of this is that the number of in production use cases remains relatively low across all of these groupings, and the number in production is also equally about half or under the use cases identified. So as we look, what are the top 3 generative AI use cases that CXOs are trying to solve for? Now, this question was a multi-select, so people could pick their top 3 choices. And we clearly see things like customer service, which could be knowledge base, could be call center workers, tech, and employee productivity, which is augmenting of human capital, to be the top 2 by far today. We think that this is largely because these use cases have to do with things that generative AI is relatively good at out of the gate. Think summarization of data and the organization of data. But also, these use cases tend to be not customer facing or something that an end user would engage in. Likewise, things that have hard consequences, such as your financial operations and reporting, your human resources, and your supply chain, were all ranked fairly low by the respondents. And I'd like to draw your attention to, if we just look at the top pick, what was the most interesting? Engineering was second. We think that this really comes down to 2 criteria. One is if you have an engineering culture, that is your competitive advantage as your company is driven by tech and software, you are more likely to deploy generative AI as a top priority. Also, the size of your engineering organization has a lot to do with it. And then for this audience, I think there will be a lot of interest in this slide. What we did was we asked for your generative AI capabilities across key business areas. Are you expecting to find that innovation coming from existing vendors? People like a Workday, Salesforce, Zendesk, Atlassian. Or are you expecting to get it from new vendors, such as the venture-backed ecosystem that Evan and I spend our time working on? Or alternatively, are you going to build that software internally? And I think what you find here is that there's a lot of nuance to the data, and we can speculate as to why some of these things are, such as sales tech tends to be very forward-thinking, tends to be very modern and quick to adopt. So you could expect maybe people to find that with their existing vendors a little bit. In terms of supply chain and human resources, maybe these tools are a little bit longer in the tooth and you don't necessarily look for innovation there. Likewise, another interesting point is that in the engineering bucket, we see 24, or nearly 0.25% of the respondents think that they'll spend most of their effort building these internally. And I think it's natural as an engineer myself to want to build things from scratch. This category probably starts to shrink as new vendors and existing vendors meet engineers with new and exciting tools.
Thanks, Scott. As we look back at how organizations are bringing generative AI to life, one of the things that we looked at was around large language model use cases, and specifically how these organizations are implementing this. One of the things that we noticed, and it goes back to our prior kind of comment and belief, is that 73% of organizations are using some level of external resources, whether that's a mix of vendors, agencies, or 100% externally outsourcing their generative AI capabilities. It's one of the things that we think within these organizations that DNA isn't necessarily there to bring this stuff to life across the board. That doesn't mean that there isn't incredible talent at a lot of these enterprise organizations across these industries that can bring generative AI to life, but it's not something that they've skilled up across the entire data science team, engineering team, security team, which just takes time. I think over time, this number will reduce and more of these organizations are building these capabilities in-house, especially as they level up or skill up the talent that they already have. There's a few paradigms that we're seeing work within this large language model, generative AI environment, specifically on the tools and techniques that organizations are utilizing. As more of this goes to production, we'll even see more of an effort on observability and evaluation. But a lot of organizations just need to have the right understanding on, as they launch a model into production, have they done the early evaluation? Do they have the right training for that? And once it is in production, do they have the right observability and telemetry around it to understand when it's not working, when it is working, and be able to change that quickly? Some other things like model security are tools and techniques that people are putting into place. As we look at the broader AI security, AI governance, the threat level and threat exposure, given the fact that lots of these things have a human in the loop or internally facing and are more experimental budgets versus dedicated budgets that they've scaled out with generative AI. AI governance and AI security will become more of a problem and pressing issue over the next 1 to 2 years as that implementation and kind of the breadth or exposure increases. There's some other implementation things that we've noticed, such as RAG and vector databases, have been a model that initially came out as a way to protect yourself and have some security where you weren't enriching all of the core foundational models. But that's holding true for a variety of ways for a lot of organizations to put a stake in the ground and have a ground truth as they bring generative AI into production. Most of the organizations that we've talked to are utilizing out-of-the-box solutions, say like an OpenAI and their ChatGPT or Llama. But a lot of the larger organizations, specifically those with over $500 million in spend, are bringing that stuff into their own managed cloud and moving beyond just using the APIs, where really a lot of that vector database and RAG starts to kind of hold true as they need to bring that stuff to life.
Yeah, Evan, I think it's worth noting that most organizations, as they try and deploy this generative AI LLMs within their products, are thinking about it as a all-in strategy, in that some of their organizations will use a combination of technology, whether it's owning their own model all the way to these public models, such as ChatGPT. Part of that is the cost goes up in terms of the skill sets that you need to have on your team, as well as the compute that you need to own goes up as well. The farther you get into owning your own model, whereas then it takes the average developer, the average user can much more use that ChatGPT API much easier. So we'll see organizations go to multiple layers, if you will, but they're making those decisions both on skill set and finances.
Absolutely. So the last thing we'll leave you with, kind of in summary, is if we go back to the beginning, we have a strong level, at least among this group of survey respondents, that budgets are increasing. There's a stabilization on the downside, specifically within hiring, and that a lot of that excitement is due to kind of this AI wave. And so we'll see more being implemented there, especially as a lot of these enterprise buyers are not only looking at implementing generative AI, but also looking at the tools and vendors and SaaS solutions that they can have that have generative AI components that will either augment their employees, make them more efficient, reduce costs. And so that's, I think, one of the places where we have a lot of excitement over the next 1 to 2 years.
So Evan and Scott, one of the things I found really interesting was the 36.5 as far as the average number of use cases, and only 2 of those around 5.5% are in production. Not sure if you asked this, but I know you spend a lot of time with enterprise buyers. Do you think that slowness in rollout is more because of legal, like data security, data privacy, and compliance reasons? Or do you think it's we're trying to decide which experiment is going to give them the highest ROI or some blend of that?
Yeah, in our experience talking with really large enterprises, the first 6 months was really around just collecting what are the use cases and then rifling through them to figure out which ones were not only going to provide a lot of value to their organization, but what ones that were also technically capable. Did they have the data organized in a way that they could solve that problem? Did they have the skill set to build that? Um, a lot of these use cases are internal facing. So things like security of your AI model may be less important, but certainly things like governance. And we all know of use cases or examples where the model went off and just started making things up. That does matter. If you think about an HR use case and somebody asking about a leave policy, or if you're on the finance team and someone's asking you about projections for numbers over the next 6, 12 months, those things can't be hallucinated. Those have to have some ground truth to them. So I think it was really a combination of a whole lot of factors on why we only have two on average in production.
I heard another thing which surprised me. I should have thought of it, but globally there's different regulatory and laws about how you can leverage AI. So if you're a multinational large enterprise, you can't do the same things in the UK that you can do in the US versus what you can do in Japan. I wonder if that's also part of that is global rollout's going to be more difficult.
Yeah. I think the other thing that we're seeing is, GPTs and large language models have been around for years. But when, OpenAI kind of burst onto the scene, it was known well across the board. It wasn't just data scientists and those in the know in the AI world, but it was the person down the street. It was the board member across the entire organization. And I think what we saw was a lot of enterprises just had this incredible hammer, and they were just trying to find the use cases to hit with it. Oh, we've got ChatGPT. We could put it here. We could put it here. And a lot of the places where it naturally went day one was summarization. And I think for a lot of these large organizations, it went to summarization with a human in the loop. That was a place where they could have a level of comfort, which is why we've seen a lot of it on knowledge bases, customer service, things of those areas. I think a lot of these organizations are starting to get a handle around, hey, we need to have a practice of what are the governance, which isn't necessarily a tool, but it's a set of principles, a set of practices. It's an understanding across the organization. And so I think a lot of that takes time. We're starting to see, and I think that optimism is starting to catch up, where more and more of the stuff is getting really into production. And the use cases are beyond just a summarization. And I think that's where a lot of these SaaS vendors, and especially the new startups, there's a ton of excitement around that. It also means there's a lot of noise for enterprise buyers. They have a ton of options. But I think that the excitement, it'll start to weed out over time those that are kind of coming to the top.
Evan, you gave me an opportunity to double click on something. And it's hard to ask you to do this, but you had to slide by function, whether to use a new vendor, they'll build it internally, or an existing vendor. That's the one. So I don't know if we're going to be the definitive answer, but I've heard a lot of debate upon new native AI solutions. They want to go in, they want to get their product in the testing, the experimental phase. Are you finding, or do you have a perspective on, are there budgets being set aside by these large technology buyers that are AI experimental? And it's like, you want to tap into that budget as a vendor, see what's available, what applications, use cases have been defined, and whether my product can fit into that. Is that primarily experimental budget, or is it core IT spend budget?
I think historically we've seen a lot of this as an experimental budget. That doesn't mean that those budget sizes are small. These can still be, hundreds of $1,000s, $1 million contract values. But when you look at a lot of these large organizations, it's a sliver and they kind of have it more as experimental. I think that is changing, especially now and even over the next year. As people are planning for their 2025 budgets, they're putting real line items in there, specifically around things on observability, on AI, the different models that they're going to pull into production. I think the other piece to this that we're finding is interesting is it's not just those they're building, but especially here, they're looking for their sales SaaS solutions, their human resource SaaS solutions, their marketing SaaS solutions to bring this stuff to bear to them, whether that's their existing vendor or net new. And I think we see that even when we asked earlier, is generative AI a capability that you need to have or talking about in the renewal cycle? And 38% view that as a very high importance. And so I think those questions will come up. And that also means a bit of an unlock on some of this experimental as well as real budget that's tied to AI.
I know a lot of our sponsors here at SaaS Metrics Palooza have SaaS platforms for the Office of Finance. So when you see financial operations and a majority of spend will be allocated to existing vendor, that's good news. The bad news is your product roadmap better move pretty quickly.
Very true.
So,
yeah, I would say the one other thing we're seeing from enterprises as they shift this way is they're starting to look at what the contractual language is around the generative AI that people are baking into their tools. So just there is no industry standard today, but over time it's something for you, your sales team, your legal team to be prepared to navigate some different contractual terms.
And then the last thing, we're going to wrap up here, and if I missed it, I really apologize. But did you ask a question about when it comes to large language models, whether they're going to use a third party or build it internally? Is it a big over-indexing on let's buy versus make?
Yeah, we've asked that question a handful of times. I think what we saw was a year ago, there was uncertainty, and a lot of organizations were thinking about building their own foundational models, for instance. I think what we've seen is that number has drastically come down. Most large organizations aren't necessarily trying to go build their own foundational model. That doesn't mean that they aren't building purpose-built or small language models, whether that's in insurance or, say, for fraud monitoring or something of that instance. But I think a lot are getting a level of trust around the foundational models that are out there, whether that's, like a GPT or Llama or something like that. But what they are really doing is they're going beyond just kind of a general fine tuning. And so a lot of them are implementing a RAG infrastructure, having their own data kind of be isolated out and using that as their ground truth. So they'll use a foundational model to just understand general language, but having the right level of enrichment to say, hey, here's what a claim is in insurance and how all of that knowledge around that. And so I think that's the place where we're seeing organizations building that type of workflow around large language models.
Okay. Unfortunately, we have to wrap up. I could talk to you guys for another hour at least. For everybody in the audience, highly recommend you go just do a quick search for the Battery Venture State of Enterprise Tech Spend report. Don't know if you have the link here, guys, that you want to share.
It's on the battery.com blog.
Battery.com blog. And then I do have one last question. My favorite report in 2023 was the Battery Ventures State of the Open Cloud. Are you going to be redoing that in 2024?
Yeah, that's a conference that we host every year for some founders. And you can expect to start to see that trickle out over October and fully launch in November.
I recommend everyone in the audience. It's for me, the best report in the industry. So be ready for the State of the Open Cloud 2024 for Battery Ventures. Evan, Scott, thank you so much for speaking here at SaaS Metrics Palooza 24.
Thanks, Ray.